Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to start. I feel like we have critical mass, and thank all of you very much for coming so quickly after the previous session. My name is Ahmed Dermish from the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and I'm honored to be here today to help this panel, support this panel, discuss the issue of moving beyond correspondent banking relationships and trying to identify innovative solutions to what is effectively a considerable global problem. In the AFI context and at the GPF, since 2014, this has been a consistent issue on the agenda. And here we are, 4 years later, and it continues to be an issue. And I think what we'll see from the stories and the experiences presented by the panel, that there's plenty of stories that we'll hear of the issues with correspondent banking, not for just small markets, but for large markets as well, really demonstrating the fact that it's inhibiting the ability to plan, it's inhibiting the ability to invest, and it's really inhibiting a lot of the freedoms that a lot of our markets and countries expect to be able to sort of facilitate economic growth. And it's important to put in context up front that we're talking about an issue that isn't just the markets themselves highlighting as a problem. FATF and other global standard setters have also indicated that correspondent banking and the de-risking that's associated with it needs to stop, and yet it continues, and the solution itself does not seem to be in fixing the correspondent banking relationships, or CBR, as you'll hear us say. So part of this panel is to answer that question or address the question, can we move beyond it? But most importantly, you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to my esteemed panelists who have much more experience in context. And so I'd like to kindly introduce Governor Atalina from the Central Bank of Samoa as our theme setter, to introduce her perspective and to give us some really solid grounding on the issue, and to kick off the panel. Governor?
Okay, thank you, Ahmed. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be part of this discussion this afternoon. I know we're standing between you and your lunch, and like all economists say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. But I'm particularly, especially thankful that I was given this, the easiest task of the panel this afternoon. My role is just to set the theme for the panel discussion. And I'm looking forward to it because this issue really goes to the heart of, it's something that's close to me because of we're experiencing the same issue in our small island jurisdictions. There have been concerns over the decline in corresponding banking relationships, which impact the ability to send and receive international payments, but also encourage black market, like the flow of payments underground. So, like Ahmed said, we want to listen to the panel and innovate solutions to move beyond corresponding banking relationships. So I'll just go through to see what does it look like, what is de-risking. So as you can see from the slide, we'll be mainly focusing on the second bullet point. Perhaps this is the one that's more relevant here in our discussions this afternoon, and hopefully we'll be hearing possible solutions. But as you can see, de-risking takes many forms, and not all jurisdictions are affected by de-risking, and the affected jurisdiction or regions are affected differently. So I take it that all of you gathered here are from jurisdictions that have been adversely affected by de-risking. The motivations of de-risking are complex, but they can be broadly categorized in those 4 areas. These were identified by a research conducted by AFI, and G24, and published in 2015, and identified a number of key drivers of de-risking. Of course, there's risk and uncertainty with the regulatory expectations and the presence of UN sanctions resulting in some banks' reluctance to deal with sanctioned countries. And then we have the regulatory environment where there's weak prudential and AML regulatory frameworks in affected countries. And there's the bank profitability concerns, pressure on profit margins, with corresponding banking relationships and dealing with higher risk customers or countries. But I want to reduce risk appetite from financial institutions. So these are like the key drivers of de-risking that has been broadly classified and grouped under these 4 headings. And the people or the main those most affected by de-risking from Samoa, where we have 25% of our GDP is from remittances. So when they close down bank accounts for remittance service providers, so that really has an effect on families of migrant workers. And of course, we have small businesses that need working capital or trade finance that rely on corresponding banking arrangements to be processed, and that therefore impact those small businesses. And there's the recipients of life-saving aid in active conflict, post-conflict disaster situations. In Samoa is one of the, and everywhere in the Pacific, we have an average of a cyclone that comes around an average every 5 years. So we are affected by either a natural disaster on average. The last 5 years, we had 3 major natural disasters. We have a tsunami, and then a cyclone, and then another cyclone within a span of 5 years. So you see people back home depend on remittances to rebuild while waiting for aid. And with de-risking, that also has an effect on getting this money to the people that need it the most. And sometimes AML CFT policies may be self-defeating to the extent that they reduce the transparency of financial flows. So I just borrowed this slide from Robin. The AFI network has played an important role in raising awareness with the World Bank, the IMF, the G20, and the standard-setting bodies on the impact of de-risking for developing countries because it impedes on their financial inclusion initiatives. So Robin will elaborate if anyone would like to know more of the work that AFI has been doing or is doing or plan to take forward this work. So so we have here the main action points. The Financial Stability Board also responded, like other standard-setting bodies, also responded to the decline in CBRs by putting together this 4-point action plan to assess and address this concern, and that is detailed in the FSB report to G20 finance ministers and central bank governors in March 2018. But I point your attention to action point 4, strengthening tools for due diligence. So technical solutions such as KYC utilities have the potential to assist in conducting due diligence and reducing compliance costs. So all this, the tools for the action point 4 is mainly speaking towards what is available to try and strengthen or improve due diligence to help address AML CFT concerns. So you see here The proposed solutions for decline in correspondent banking include technological innovations, such as using big data, machine learning to facilitate due diligence processes. There's the legal entity identifier systems and the application of fintech. So you have KYC utilities, the legal entity identifier systems, and fintech are all tools that help improve due diligence. So as you can see, there has been a really big focus on strengthening tools with the hope that this can lead to re-risking. But the panel session today is really looking at is there another way to look at this? Is there another opportunity for an innovative solution? Or can we move beyond banks and CPRs? So this is really the question that the panel will address today, and we will have to see from our panel members what the solutions are or how to address this. But from my perspective, if it can't be done, regulators would have to carefully assess a proposed model. Well, nothing new comes without risks, and we will have to approach it with caution. Regulatory sandboxes, as we've been talking about it, with the minimum prerequisites that must not be related to fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing, and should embed a consumer protection in their offering and should not risk financial stability. So perhaps the biggest positive for me of this de-risking issue is the platform that it has provided for innovative solutions to step up, making us really evaluate how we conduct our business and monitoring RegTech, and push us to seek better ways to do these things. And with that, I'll leave that to the panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Governor. That was a perfect segue and a great introduction. No pressure. Yeah. She didn't just say you had to share with us what the solutions are. So, but thank you. That was really, really brilliant and a great way to kick off the discussion. Before we do kick off the discussion, I'd actually like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, primarily so they can also describe the organizations that they work with better than I can. So, Victor?
Thank you so much. Actually, I represent Russian Association of Electronic Money and Remittance. Also, I lead a group in Russian State University for payment technologies regulation. And also, what is probably more important in that context, I am an expert from private sector in FATF, in FATF.
Thanks, Ahmed. Good evening, everyone. I am Georgette Jean-Louis. I am the Director General of the Central Bank of Haiti and a member of the board of the Central Bank. We are from the Caribbean, and as such, in our regional initiatives in AFI, I represent the Caribbean as well. The whole Caribbean is facing the same problem that the governor of Samoa just described, because we are small island economies, but I'm going to say more after.
Hello, my name is Adrien Anthony, so I'm Head of Legal and Compliance for Transfer2. We are one of the sponsors of this event. Transfer2 is an intermediary payment service provider, so we provide payment services to licensed and regulated payment service provider. So we are an intermediary. So of course we know this phenomenon firsthand because it impacts us and our partners.
Great, thank you. And with that intro, I'd like to jump into two presentations. First from Victor, sort of setting the context, and then followed by Adrian looking into some specific solutions.
Can you put a... Okay. Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank our estimated governor for the very good introduction in the risking issue. So in my presentation, probably I would like to emphasize a little bit different aspect of the risking, and also probably I will go a little bit deeper in position of FATF. We already have a definition of the risking. It's quite very old phenomena. It's the name firstly appeared in insurance, and only in 2012 it appeared in FAT recommendation in the context in which we are using it right now. It is important to understand that FATF, as an organization which actually manages worldwide politics of IMLFT, is based on a risk-based approach. And it is probably the one and main pillar of FATF policy. What does it mean? That FATF says that risk-based approach is based on proportionality. All the attention and efforts and investment must be allocated in the points where risk is or might be higher. And in situation where risk is low, some simplified measures can be applied, or even AML, CFT measures might be cancelled at all. So what is also important, and what FATF states in its documents, that we need to understand that all risks are different, and risks are relative, never absolute, and understanding of risk always or almost always requires understanding of new trends. So why in 2012 the risking attracted so much attention? There are a lot of reasons. Probably to scare you a little bit from very beginning, I will give you some kind of diagram. This diagram demonstrates amount of fines imposed on leading United States banks in the case of violation of AMLFT rules. We see that that amount of money is absolutely huge. I suppose that is comparable to the probably monthly budget of Haiti, or even more. Okay, you can comment on that. And of course, fear of punishment make a great difference in psychology of regulators. Another thing which we need to understand that we have very well known in economy and psychology so-called asymmetric awareness of regulators and financial institutions. Because regulator often operates with fact, while the internal control must operate with probabilities, with something which might happen. And just to put it very short, from the theory of asymmetric awareness, we know very well that it's a very bad situation to control. And only thing is to try to make it symmetric due to kind of knowledge exchange. So what forms of the risking exist? It was already mentioned that, say, classical and basic form is termination of contracts with the customer. Second one is refusing to enter into a contract with a potential client, when you just refuse your client in the door of your bank. What is also possible is kind of refusing to carry out some of client instruction. Not a total refusing, but some of instruction might be cancelled or denied. And of course, we have different examples. The probably well-known examples is very broad interpretation of sanction. Probably you know in case of Russia, formal sanctions are very limited. We have only few legal entities which are really under current international sanction. But a lot of financial institutions and companies abroad stop to work with Russian business just because of fear of sanction. And other possibilities include refusing to expand business, don't allowing to people to enter new market and something like that. One thing which I would like to mention and which is very important is abstaining from development of new technologies, because new technologies from very beginning mostly are not well understood and look probably scaring, and we see a lot of potential threats in new technology, and for regulators often it's much more easier just to prohibit new technologies than try to understand how it works and try to implement some set of rules. Consequences might be different, and probably everybody in the room at least one time in his life felt some consequence of the risk. But some consequences are really dramatic. For example, in 2015, something about 89%, yes, 89% of remittance from United States to Somalia was blocked. And as you know, Somalia was very dependent from remittance, from money transfer from United States. And it made great social and economical problem in the country. American banks, so they refused to work with Somali because Somali was in a black or gray list, and regulators say indirectly, implicitly recommend don't work with Somali. And the problem is also asymmetric. It's not so huge money for the bank, but as you know, fines are not depends from amount of money. In current European Union AML/FT regulation, even if you transfer €1 violated AML/FT, you will be punished at minimal amount, which possibly is 500,000 or something like that. We have kind of threshold in regulation. So, as I mentioned, for innovation it became a huge problem. So innovation might be shut down at all. And also, as the government said, we have not decreasing of AMLT risk. We have kind of increasing, because customers are just moving to kind of black market of financial services for illegal lender, illegal money transfer, Hawala scheme, something like that. And for example, we see very clearly the situation in correspondent banking for money transfer system. It's a huge problem for money transfers, for remittance. During the last years, about 1/3 of remittance companies has most or almost all accounts closed. And of course, as a result, we see it clearly in process of bringing cash through the border, money move scheme, and something like that. I can give you some a little bit different example just to give another flavor. See, here we see a table which demonstrates a share of cash payments in different countries in 2014. And we clearly see that in Germany, which was very strict country, strictest country in European Union in terms of AML/FT, the percentage of cash payment is highest in the Europe. Now Germans becomes much, much better. They pioneering something like video identification, something like that. But it's a very good example how de-risking works in absolutely unpredictable way. So it's not so easy to identify de-risking, because de-risking is never isolated problem. It is part of some wrong process in general AML, CFT system. And some ideas must be implemented absolutely definitely. The basic idea, in my opinion, is rejection of zero failure approach. A bank or any other organization must not be punished for every single failure. It must be considered if bank benefit from the failure, or it was a single failure, or it's systematic failure, something like that. But now global regulators and SSB says clearly that no local regulators must implement zero failure approach. Of course, we must consider it a set of different factors, and it is not a very easy problem. So another idea which is now very popular is focusing on soft law. We don't work only with the law. We work with manual reviews, best practices, comfort letters, letters of no objection. It's a very good mechanism. It must be implemented very fast, not like laws, and it works perfect in different segments, and I believe it was much more attention from a regulation body. So, as I mentioned, FATF made a statement of the risk in 2014, saying that, in very few words, that the risking is not good and we need to fight with it. Then FAT mentioned de-risking in guidance for risk-based approach, and it was clear understanding that the problem became more and more heavy. And now FAT by itself start to adapt its own documents to minimize the risking. For example, now we are working with FAT to exclude, for example, non-face-to-face customer KYC as a risk factor, and FAT promised us that something will be done. So very briefly, I will make conclusion. De-risking is a natural process. It arises in different fields, and it is natural, not good, but natural. De-risking leads to high risk, not to minimizing of the risk. De-risking is inevitably a consequence of disproportionate regulation. If you have de-risking, it means that your regulation is disproportionate in other places. And I absolutely agree with my colleagues that de-risking is a big challenge to our community, and we need to make some solid measures and solid statement to do something with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. That was a brilliant crash course in de-risking, actually.
German people would like to sit
Yeah, we'll definitely have time for questions afterwards. I'd like to just pass it to Adrian, who's going to sort of move the discussion a little bit towards potential solutions.
Yes.
Now that we have that sort of umbrella view before we get into the dialogue.
And also a vision from the field. Thank you. So I'm just going to give another overview of what is de-risking and what, in my opinion, are the causes for de-risking. So is the phenomenon of a financial institution that decides to entirely cut off an entire field or an entire region due to higher risk. So the root cause, and I think we already covered them in a way, is of course the compliance costs that those banks are facing. I'm going to display some numbers after, and of course, as a bank, you make a very easy calculation between what is the compliance cost involved, what is the risk of being fined and receive consequences, regulatory consequences, and what's the gain of operating in this region or in this jurisdiction or to serve these kind of financial institutions. So we have seen that this calculation is easily is really impacting the Caribbean region, especially. So also another thing that I'm seeing is the information asymmetry. So we have different regulatory requirements, conflicting regulatory regime from time to time. I'm taking the example of, for example, you have the obligation as a payment institution or bank to obtain information on the beneficiary of a transaction, of an international transaction, but the regulatory regime in the destination country prevent or prohibits the fact that you get this information because of data protection laws. So you see, I mean, this could also be, it turns into additional expense, manual process, and therefore more cost and potentially de-risking. So these are some data that I managed to gather across the internet. So worldwide, the number of correspondent banking relationships has decreased by 25% since 2009. So it's really a trend, and it's really and it's even faster now. 28% of MTOs can no longer access banking services. So you were mentioning the de-risking of Somalia. It was also impacting British institution at that time, and Barclays was, at that moment, I remember, the latest bank that agreed to cover Somalia, and it was really catastrophic for the country. On average, 60 million is spent. It's an average for every kind of financial institution, but for example, if you take major international banks, it's more in the 500 million to 1 billion a year in compliance costs, knowing that from what I've heard, it's 40% of this sum is used to cover international payments, because this is one of the most riskiest activity of the bank. So it represents, depending on the banks and institution, of course, but between 15 and 20% of the OPEX of the bank. So it's really impressive. It was 10% 10 years ago. So it has almost doubled in 10 years. The estimated decline in the number of cross-border payments for countries that are identified as high-risk jurisdiction is immediately 10%. So that means that you have not been the risk yet, but just being identified as high-risk jurisdiction, or, for example, jurisdiction of primary concern, translate to a 10% decrease in your international payments. The cumulative fine since 2009 between US and EU for the financial sector is $342 billion. So it's really impressive. You were mentioning HSBC. Right after HSBC, you know that BNP Paribas was sanctioned $9 billion for a series of less than 10 payments to Cuba and Iran. I think it was really very specific. And
where's the blacklist?
yeah,
Where is it?
yeah. There are several lists. For example, you take the jurisdiction of primary concern from the US Department of Justice. France is a jurisdiction of primary concern, and Austria. So you're like, okay, so who is not in the list? It's more the question. Yeah. The FATF, FATF, there is no more country except from Iran, North Korea, of course, but and most of the countries are back into the gray or white list. So I'm going to provide some technical solutions, regulatory proposition as well, and also open to some proposition that could lead to go around this problematic. So from a technical perspective, we've seen, what are the international banks face? They face manual processes and high costs. So what you can do to attract banks as a jurisdiction or as a regulator is to tell them, my ecosystem allows you to have an access to information in a very easy way. And the information, I can guarantee that this information is true and is verified. So therefore, you don't have to verify it manually. You don't have to give a call. You don't have to send an email to receive a passport via email. You just have it because you have the, so the information is consolidated. For example, we have seen in Ghana that the National Identification Authority has created a central identification database. So, this kind of initiative translates immediately into the facility to access the data. Another initiative that is not exactly related to identification, but it's related to credit info, which is also very important for international bank. When they process a payment to a company, for example, they have to verify this kind of information. And the Western African country have created a central register for credit information that is accessible by by all the ecosystem. This is exactly the right direction, in my opinion, and it provides security. Then we have the biometric identification. So we have some countries. Yesterday we were talking about blockchain and identification and the national register. We have some country where it's impossible to obtain a security in the identification of an individual. So this must be something that should be a top priority and is the root cause of the de-risking problem in a way, in my opinion, or at least it's a consequence. Then international wire transfer regulation. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. So if you have a conflict between two regulations, it's very difficult to do business because you don't know what information you can ask, and you are not going to be able to have the minimum amount of data that allow you to respect your own regulation, your own national regulation. So therefore, it's very easy for a bank to make the calculation and say, okay, let's just stop doing business here, because it's too complicated, it's a headache for us. Then AML control automation. So for example, of course, this is more a solution for the bank itself, is automating the controls. So for example, we use in payment service firm what we call entity consolidation. That means that we use lots of data in the internet or very partial piece of data, and then we consolidate it in order to have a profile for an individual or a company. So this is something that we are doing, and that accelerates or makes it easier for us to do business. So regulatory proposition, maybe not solutions. For example, there is, one of the main obstacle for a bank has been to know the customer of the target bank. So in other words, know your customers' customers. That means that the international bank that makes the correspondent, that processes the correspondent banking, must know what is the customer of the local bank. So this, just wanted to make a quick, to underline that quickly. The FATF has made a paper dedicated to that, to know your customer's customer, to underline the fact that it's not recommended that the banks are doing it. So it's not necessary for a bank to do it. And this is still one of the root cause of the problem that we are discussing today. Is one of the reason of this extensive cost. So I just wanted to mention that. And one proposition is really to establish common payment information protocol. I would say that this is something that should be one of the priority of the central banker to provide a minimum set of information for international bank when they transact with your country. They know that they will have access to this amount of data. So what are the challenges of what we've just mentioned before? So of course, we were mentioning a central database and KYC technology. So it's the main challenge of that is that these solutions are not interoperable. So they are not they are not connected to each other. They are very difficult to access, and it's difficult to offer an open way to access these data for international banks. Then, of course, when we were talking about common protocol for international transfer information, the problematic is the lack of international and national coordination. So it makes sense only if you do that at a regional level. At a country level, it may be inefficient. Of course, for a country, the cost of this technology can be very high. The cost of centralizing all the information is very high. And as we said, the competing regulation, that because there are some other interests that are potentially above the interest of the international correspondent banking. So what can we do beyond correspondent banking? I'm going to talk just about the experience of a payment service provider that can potentially be de-risked. So we are facing, for example, one of our major international banks that decides that they are not going to provide us a bank account anymore. So that means that we potentially are cut off of the international system. So one of the solutions that is, of course, something that needs to be developed and is not exactly an operational solution yet, but it's interesting to think about it, is using distributed ledger technologies, blockchain, but not to do the payment to individual, but to settle within a ledger. So for example, if you have, let's say, a partner payment service provider in a country, instead of going through an international correspondent bank, what you do is that both are member of the same ledger and exchange token to settle between them. And instead, and these tokens are then converted locally into fiat currency, but there is no exchange through a correspondent bank. So, of course, this works only if it's like net settling, in fact. It's net settling through tokens, through a distributed ledger. So this works only, of course, if you have enough people in the ledger, but Transfer2 has just signed a partnership with Stellar recently, and we have started settling within this ecosystem, and it works. So I think this is really something that is promising, but of course, not in every case, not in every country, but at least it works for us. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks for finishing on that note as well, sort of providing a glimmer of hope that we maybe don't have to fix it, we can just do something different, which I think is kind of the principle of this discussion. I'd like to give Georgette the opportunity to jump in here and share from your perspective the experience of Haiti and your own personal experience at the bank with the consequences of de-risking.
Again, good afternoon, everyone. I think I have 3 minutes based on what Ahmed told me yesterday. Like I say, I'm from Haiti. We are based in the Caribbean. And we in the Caribbean were the first really big blocks of islands that had faced that problem of de-risking. Of course, the whole Caribbean region, basically it is tourism, financial services, and a lot of remittance. In the case of Haiti, 25% of our GDP is based on remittance. And more than 77% of that remittance come from the United States, who is one of our closest neighbors. So it is true, I have to admit, thank God, our country has never been cut off totally. Of course, our banks, since it started, had lost a lot of correspondent. For example, a lot of our banks still today have only one correspondent. But the big one, the three, we have like 3 banks that has 80% of our market. They have more than 3 correspondent banking. This is in the case of Haiti. But in the Caribbean, my other fellow jurisdiction, some of them, for example, it's well known internationally. In the case of Belize, where the whole country was part of our jurisdiction was cut from the financial system. So it is true a lot of awareness have been done. We heard from Victor and again from Adrian and even from the governor of Samoa, a lot of awareness, you know, we have some new measures from FATF. Everybody had pinch in the subject. But when I received that invitation from Robin saying beyond correspondent banking, I really thought that the solutions were fine. Unfortunately, as I go through it, it's still present. It's still present today. It is true today. We are not in the same situation where we were. I'm talking about my region. Okay? I understand there are some other regions that are emerging now. I think Africa is going through what we went through in the Caribbean in 2014, in 2015. the whole jurisdiction, we are still struggling. It is true, a lot has been done. For example, in my own country, laws were voted. The financial system has taken some steps in terms of better KYC procedures. The central bank, the regulator of the financial system, we had issued a lot of new guidelines. The problem is you don't know what the solution is. For example, we have gone to the US government, US Treasurer, at the highest level, and everybody is telling me, Treasurer say it is not me. We didn't ask the correspondent banking to do that. But when you talk to the correspondent banking, they say they are being punished. So everything they ask you to do, you do it. But at the end, we don't know what to do anymore. It is true right now, like I say, we have seen an ease, at least in our region. We are still monitoring the situation because at any day, at any moment, even I think one of our banks, about this year, they received a phone call, the relationship is being terminated. Why? There is no why. There is no why, because if you know what the why is, you will try to do it. But to close my 3 minutes, Ahmed, before we continue, I heard Adrian's solution. It is very promising, but in my situation, the way it is right now, it won't work for me because I don't have enough settlement. I don't have enough. I mean, you need in and out in order to settle. In my case, I have a lot of in, I don't have a lot of out. I cannot settle. It is still a problem that we need to find a way. Unfortunately, I don't think for the moment my region can tell you what the solution is. We find ways to go beyond it because, as a matter of fact, human will always find a way to transfer money. As I think it is the governor who concluded her remarks as saying that de-risking had brought higher risk. It is true. Before we knew all the transactions, what are they that are coming through the system? If the system is closed, people will find a way to cross border with cash, to find other means to, I don't want to say black market because I don't want to call it that illegal market. They'll find ways. Believe me, if you're talking about settlement, if we're talking about money laundering, believe me, we can use that system you're just mentioning in terms of settlement of money. But this is not what we're trying to do with that. So I'm going to close Ahmed on that so we can discuss about it.
Thanks, Rajat. And I always trust you to get a lot in a short period of time. That's why you have the capacity to do that. So you've given us a very visceral example of your situation, very similar to what Governor shared with us on Samoa. We have had 2 examples of small countries. Victor, very briefly, yesterday when we were talking, you offered the opportunity to sort of share how even large markets suffer from this as well as small. I think the phrase you used was, while the fat man is starving, the sick man is dying, right? And so in that context, can you give us some examples for understanding how the system at large doesn't benefit from this?
Okay, thank you for remembering that statement. And I can give you a huge amount of examples. For example, I will start with United States. Approximately probably 5 years ago, in States, regulators start so-called Operation Storm, I don't know how they spell it exactly. And the basic idea was that Association of Bankers published a list of, say, suspicious businesses, money transfer, microfinancial organization, something like that. And in very short amount of time, most of correspondent account was closed. We had with my colleagues a small remittance company in the United States. All accounts was closed because it was a remittance company, it was small company. No reason. In fact, it turned out that that position was not an official position of Banker Association. It was position of the few members of management of association. But as a result, I believe that hundreds of companies had to start the business. In Russia, situation is a little bit different because Russia formally has very tough regulation for payment services. Actually, very roughly, to make payment services, you must be a bank. But I need to thank our central bank that they, starting from 15 years ago, actually implemented something what we call now sandboxes. They paid some attention to new technologies. They didn't close in the moment of the new project. So for us, main problem of de-risking was probably high technological segment. Because if you are a high technology company, it's not so difficult to establish correspondent relation. Now it returns for cryptocurrency companies. I wouldn't discuss cryptocurrency is good or not, must be prohibited or must be allowed. But if you now are a cryptocurrency company, for you it's almost impossible to open an account with Russian bank. Does it mean that government actually stop the activity of such company in Russia? Of course no, because you can go to Switzerland. Our neighbor country, Belarus, make kind of crypto offshore. You can very easy to register a cryptocurrency company and got a correspondent relation in Belarus. And we see very clearly that it didn't solve no problem. For example, my friend from banks of Belarus and from National Bank, Cohen, says that now they see that just people moved from Russian jurisdiction to Belarus without any improvement. So we have many examples. It's not so critical for us, like for Haiti, I understand very well, from, I don't know, Vanuatu or something, small country. But I believe in long scale and long-term perspective, the risking is very dangerous for financial inclusion, for social situation, for economical situation, and I'm sorry for repeating myself, we must, not may, but must, to do something with that. Thank you.
Well, it's interesting the context you describe, I think, highlights well the unintended consequences of bad policy, right? And then also the unintended consequences of even, you know, not good policy per se, but, you know, policy with intention, not well thought through, also has these knock-on effects of pushing transactions elsewhere, et cetera. And it's kind of hard to take that big picture sometimes without knowing what's going to happen. Governor, do you have any thoughts on sort of what's been shared with the panel at all that you'd like to jump in with?
When I came to this session, I was hopeful for a solution to the de-risking issue in the Pacific and in Samoa. And my colleague from Haiti has really laid down what's the issues that we've been facing. And they clarify regulatory expectations. You do it, and you go meet all of them in Washington and in the U.S. Fed and the U.S. Treasury, and they throw you around like it's not me, it's them. And then you do all this legislative and all this compliance to meet compliance in your own jurisdiction, and then nothing happens. Austrac in Australia, and New Zealand, our closest partners, Austrac issued a report saying that the Pacific corridor is low risk, and yet there's no reaction from the banks regarding that report. So I'm just wondering whether what we're doing it's enough. Is it enough? Whether we're doing all this work and whether is it enough to turn this around? So that's why I was very hopeful for a solution beyond corresponding banking relationships, because I was in a panel at the IMF, and one of the panelists was from the U.S. Secretary something, and one of my solutions was to avoid U.S. corresponding banks, and it hit a notch somewhere. So, so I'm hoping for that. I remain hopeful that we'll find a solution. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and you've segued well to what was in effect the final question for the panel is, what are the solutions that have promise? So you mentioned, in a sense, the distributed ledger component, right? Not going so far as being cryptocurrency, but rather simply being an infrastructure that removes the intermediary, right? And this is an open discussion for everyone. Yesterday, Georgette, you were talking about coping mechanisms and sort of working around it. How different is that from an actual solution, or is it just, an imperfect solution? So what do you think in the last few minutes we have in the panel are actual solutions that have promise, hopefully to make the governor feel a little bit better and walk away with something practical?
I am at the same position with the governor, actually. I think we are both islands people, grouping islands. We understand she's from the Pacific, I'm from the Caribbean, the North America. So we are facing exactly the same problem. So like I say, I was hoping for a solution. But like I say, the solution is not there yet. I'm sorry, people, maybe a lot of you, when you came to that panel, the title, you were hooked, like me, like there was a solution. Solution have, somebody might have a solution.
Well, do you have a solution, Leon? Okay.
Very simply, we've done an enormous study at Columbia University on de-risking and had a brains trust of regulators and service providers. So there are a number of solutions specific on the cryptocurrency. You can try Ripple. They have corridors on XRP. Then in the specific reason, the Australian Reserve Bank allow you and have allowed some central banks to open up accounts at the Australian Central Bank where remittances corridors can be opened. Then other central banks we've seen have allowed companies to open up accounts directly with the central bank, avoiding correspondent banks. So there's a central bank to central bank set of corridors. And then downstreaming. I mean, if you're in the banking business, you know what downstreaming is. That's another solution. So if you want to talk to me offline, there are quite a few solutions.
Can I just, central bank to central bank accounts, as soon as you say this money is from remittances, they will just close it. They will just...
See what they've done in New Zealand? The central bank had opened up a voucher system. That's live.
Yeah, that's a voucher system that only people with bank accounts. I'm talking about people in the villages where they don't have access, they don't have bank accounts, and the money transfer operators are their only access to those financial services.
Sure, you're absolutely right. But I mean, there's daylight, is what I'm saying. And to your question is, where's the problem coming from in the US? You've spoken to regulators. It's not OCC, I know them very well. It's your state bank regulators, state bank examiners.
Thanks a lot. Believe me, we've been to the whole round. But what you said, these are coping mechanisms. Like I said, for now, all our islands, all of us find a way to do transaction. But a financial system, it's not only about finding a way to do the transaction. You want, as an operator, when you have that responsibility, you know there are things you need to do, you do them, and everything's going to be okay. If you don't do them, there will be sanctions. That big elephant in the room that every day you wake up, you don't know what might happen. This is the problem. Of course, except for Belize who was caught, but they did find a way to do the transaction. I think through the central bank, but this is not the role of central banks. You have banks, you have commercial banks, you have all type of financial institutions. Each of them needs to do their own transaction. So these are, I mean, the best coping mechanism we find along from the central bank is cash. Cash. Cash is orderless. It doesn't, you know, it's just cash. Everything is cash. But as AFI is promoting, that has a direct impact on financial inclusion. We don't have time right now to debate about it. You do find ways, for example, in my country, we have a problem with identity, the way, you know, you do the transaction, you have tier them, you limit them and things like that. But that de-risking problem, and I think maybe next year in the next GPF, maybe the solution will be there, Robin. Maybe somebody will find that something less complicated or something that is applicable for bigger audience than the solution that Adrian talked about.
Thanks, Georgette. And I think with that note, we'll probably conclude the panel. And it seems as if, you know, my personal observation is the path beyond correspondent banking might actually have to be through correspondent banking. When we look at the mobile phone in markets that managed to leapfrog where they didn't have landlines, it was a leapfrog. You literally did not have the legacy infrastructure. So then you could start with something fresh. What's been interesting about this conversation is correspondent banking is a global infrastructure. It is present everywhere. So in a sense, this question of can we do something different implies to a degree a mix of doing something innovative, but also fixing some things. And so I'm trying to provide a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or context. I'd like to thank the panelists and ask you to thank the panelists with me. And I think it's lunchtime.